The year was 79 CE. Multiple vessels departed from Baiae as the sun disappeared behind Mount Vesuvius. On board sat Rome's most powerful senators, accompanied by amphora after amphora of Fernian wine. Their destination lay just visible across the darkening water. Private islands with no official names on any imperial map. The cargo manifests listed wine, food, musicians. They did not list the other commodity being transported. Young slaves carefully selected from markets across the empire purchased specifically for what awaited them. What happened on these islands was not hidden from Rome. It was funded by the imperial treasury, operated with senatorial approval, and documented in account ledgers that archaeologists would uncover 2,000 years later beneath the ash of Pompeii. The Bay of Naples contained multiple private islands scattered across its turquoise waters. Nissi Dust sat closest to the mainland, barely 2 miles from the resort town of Bay. Procida lay 5 miles out, large enough to support permanent buildings and staff. Pandataria, now called Ventone, sat furthest from shore at 25 mi. Parthenope occupied the space between Nida and Proida, though today it rests completely submerged beneath the waves. These were non-imperial properties like Capri. They belonged to wealthy senators, freedmen, entrepreneurs, and members of the imperial family who preferred their involvement remain unofficial. The ownership created a legal grey zone, technically Roman territory. They operated practically autonomous from mainland law. Bay provided the foundation for everything that happened offshore. Seneca called it the harbor of vice. He wrote that chastity went to die on those shores. The resort town had already earned its reputation as Rome's capital of excess. Wealthy Romans built elaborate villas along the coastline. They came to drink, gamble, and escape the social constraints of the capital. The islands extended this culture of transgression beyond even Bay's permissive boundaries. What happened in Baiae stayed in Baiae, the saying went. But islands offered something more valuable than discretion. They offered total absence of witnesses. The economic structure was purely commercial. These were not imperial retreats, but private enterprises operating for profit. Entry required membership in what functioned as an exclusive club. The fees were staggering. A single visit cost 10,000 sesterces minimum. For context, a skilled craftsman earned 800 sesterces per year. Revenue flowed from multiple sources. Entrance fees formed the base income. Slave rentals generated additional profits. Entertainment bookings, food, wine, all carried significant markups. The operations ran seasonally. May through September brought peak traffic when calm seas and warm weather made crossing comfortable. Specific families controlled specific islands. The Lucullus estate owned Nida through inheritance from Lucius Latinius Lucullus, the famous general and epicure. A consortium of freedmen operated Proida. These were former slaves who had gained wealth through trade and investment. Pandataria served dual purposes. One side housed political exiles sent by various emperors. The other side hosted the most explicit operations, its distance from the mainland providing extra security. Imperial family members held silent partnerships in several operations. They collected profits without public association. The arrangement allowed them to benefit financially while maintaining plausible deniability. The islands themselves provided natural security. Water created barriers that walls never could. No random travelers appeared unexpectedly. No merchants wandered through. Every arrival was visible from shore, every departure tracked and recorded. Maritime law of the period contained ambiguities that made prosecution difficult for activities occurring offshore, and bodies could disappear into deep water far more easily than into Italian soil. The geography was not accidental. It was essential to everything that followed. Roman senators filled the boats during their scheduled recesses. The equestrian class, Rome's business elite, made up another significant portion of visitors. Wealthy provincials seeking advancement in Roman society saw the islands as networking opportunities. Foreign dignitaries received invitations as part of diplomatic entertainment. The age range skewed older, primarily men between 30 and 60. Economics alone prevented lower classes from participating. A single visit cost what a laborer earned in a decade. The invitation system operated entirely through private networks. No public advertisements existed. Current members vouched for potential newcomers through personal recommendation. Written invitations arrived on wax tablets. Fragments recovered from ancient shipwrecks show the careful language used. They mentioned symposiums, philosophical retreats, literary gatherings. Never did they specify the actual activities planned. Discretion protocols governed every stage. Invitations contained no explicit content. Recipients understood through coded phrases developed over years. A philosophical retreat meant something specific to those familiar with the system. Transportation followed deliberate patterns designed to avoid attention. Private boats departed from Baiae docks after sunset. Guests traveled from their villas to the harbor and covered litters. Witnesses saw wealthy men leaving but not where they went. Return trips occurred before dawn. Public respectability remained intact. Imperial postal boats were sometimes diverted to transport high-ranking officials. This constituted direct misuse of state resources for private purposes. The Silence Compact bound everyone together. Each visitor became implicated through attendance. Mutual knowledge created mutual vulnerability. Prosecution would require exposing oneself. Blackmail potential kept participants loyal to the system. No surviving trial record mentions testimony against island operations. The silence held for decades. Financial barriers exceeded legal ones' ineffectiveness. A single visit equaled a year's salary for skilled labor. Regular visitors spent 50,000 sesterces or more per season. Only the ultra-wealthy could participate. The economic exclusivity created a club smaller and more secretive than any legal restriction could achieve. The islands served social functions beyond their primary purpose. Business deals were negotiated during visits. Political alliances formed between men who shared compromising experiences. Patronage networks established themselves through these connections. Shared transgression became a bonding mechanism more powerful than family ties. What happened on the islands created loyalty that traditional Roman values could not match. The system was self-reinforcing. Participation guaranteed continued participation. Silence guaranteed mutual protection, and money guaranteed the system would continue operating. The slave supply originated primarily from Dos, the largest market in the Mediterranean. At peak operation, 10,000 slaves sold there daily. Secondary markets in Ephesus, Alexandria, and Antioch supplemented the flow. Specialized dealers understood island requirements. They were not purchasing randomly. Every acquisition followed specific criteria. Financial records preserved in Pompey's Ash document. The selection standards. Age range ran from 12 to 18 for both male and female slaves. Physical appearance mattered enormously. Roman aristocratic culture maintained specific beauty standards. Origin influenced value significantly. Greek slaves commanded premium prices. Syrian, Egyptian, and GIC slaves filled different preferences. Each region was marketed for particular characteristics. Skills increased value dramatically. Musicians, dancers, and acrobats sold for substantially more than agricultural workers. The price differential was stark. An attractive youth cost 3,000 to 8,000 sesterces. An agricultural slave sold for 5 to 800. The market recognized and priced what buyers wanted. A grading system categorized slaves upon arrival. First class designation went to the most attractive and skilled. Second class went to those suitable for performance and service roles. Third class handled manual labor, cleaning, and food preparation. The category determined treatment, resale value, and survival probability. Training occurred in mainland facilities around Baiae. Purpose-built schools prepared slaves for island deployment. The curriculum required 2 to 3 months completion. Slaves learned Roman etiquette and Greek poetry recitation. Dance and music instruction was mandatory. Language fluency in both Latin and Greek was expected. Appearance received meticulous attention. Obedience was conditioned through systematic punishment and reward. The numbers involved were substantial. Financial records from Pompey banking houses mention island contracts for 50 to 100 slaves per season. Multiple islands operating simultaneously meant 2 to 400 slaves in the system at any time. Turnover ran high. Slaves were retired after 3 to 5 years when they aged beyond desirability. Replacement purchases occurred annually. Account books tracked these transactions in precise detail. Roman law provided the framework that made everything possible. Enslaved people possessed zero legal protection for bodily autonomy. Legal definitions classified slaves as property. The specific term was instrumentum vocal, meaning speaking tools. Owner rights were absolute. Consent was legally irrelevant because slaves could not give or withhold it. Injuries to slaves qualified only as property damage. Prosecution required the owner to file complaint. Island operators owned their slaves outright. No outside complaints were possible. A rotation system moved slaves between islands based on demand. High-demand individuals were rented to other operators. Rental agreements survive in papyri collections. Standard rate was 500 sesterces per week per slave. This created a secondary market among island owners. The most profitable slaves generated 10,000 sesterces annually just in rental fees. Conquest supplied another steady stream. When legions subdued provinces, slave-taking always followed. Officers selected captives based on age and appearance. Certain children were set aside for specialized markets, rather than bulk sale. These selections followed patterns. Officers knew which types brought premium prices, and where to sell them. Transport from eastern markets took weeks. Ships moved slaves along established trade routes. The class's Messensis Rome's naval fleet based at nearby Misenum occasionally provided vessels for imperial purposes. Children travelled aboard well-appointed ships. Manifest documents listed them as household attendants. The terminology obscured their actual destination and fate. Multiple historical sources document what occurred on the islands. Seneca the Elder wrote about the operations during his lifetime. Martial referenced them in his epics. Juvenal condemned them in his satires. Financial records from Pompeii and Herculaneum provide unemotional data. Later Christian writers preserve specific details while condemning pagan practices. The sources have biases, but they converge on essential facts. The activities were framed as Greek symposium tradition. In Greek culture, symposia meant drinking parties combined with intellectual discussion. Roman aristocrats romanticized Greek practices and used this framework as legitimizing cover. Island operators marketed their services as authentic Greek cultural experiences. The framing allowed participants to claim they pursued cultural education rather than vice. Banquets followed predictable structures that multiple sources confirm. Guests arrived at dusk. Feasts began immediately upon landing. Wine consumption was central to everything. Fernian wine and expensive vintage flowed without restriction. Enslaved servers wore progressively less clothing as meal courses continued. Entertainment filled the spaces between food service. Musicians performed. Dancers moved between tables. Acrobats demonstrated their skills. As night progressed, performances became increasingly explicit. Private rooms were available after communal dining ended. Entertainment fell into distinct categories. Performance acts dominated the early evening. Dancers portrayed mythological scenes carefully selected for content. Leta and the Swan showed Zeus taking a mortal lover. Ganymede and Zeus depicted divine desire for a young man. These myths featured gods conquering mortals. They provided symbolic permission structure for what guests desired. Acrobatic displays were choreographed to showcase bodies rather than pure skill. Musicians played while wearing minimal clothing. Living sculptures had slaves pose as famous Greek statues, which classical tradition depicted unclothed. Interactive entertainment began later in the evening. Bathing assistants meant slaves attended to guests in elaborate facilities. Symposium games involved drinking contests where slave participation served as prizes for winners. Nocturnal philosophy was a euphemism appearing in multiple sources. Martial explicitly mentions games that young bodies played for old men's pleasure. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. The physical layouts enabled different activities simultaneously. Each island contained 3 to 5 separate buildings. A central feast hall hosted communal gatherings. Private cubicula, small bedrooms radiated from the center like spokes. Bathhouse complexes featured heated pools fed by underground furnaces. Gardens included secluded grow and fountains positioned for privacy. The architecture deliberately separated activities. It created plausible deniability. What happened in private spaces could be denied because no witnesses existed. Different islands developed specializations over time. Nisida focused on theatrical performances. Elaborate costumes and staging equipment were permanently housed there. Procida emphasized athletic competitions. Wrestling matches followed Greek tradition of competing unclothed. Pondicherry, furthest from the mainland, hosted the most explicit activities. Distance provided security. Parthenon catered exclusively to guests seeking female slaves. The reputation differences attracted different clientele. Regular visitors knew which islands suited their preferences. A rental system governed access to individual slaves. Guests paid base admission for entry and food. Additional fees purchased specific slaves' time. Hourly rates varied from 50 to 200 sesterces depending on the slave's ranking. Overnight companionship cost 500 to 1 Oz and sesterces. Financial ledgers track these transactions in clinical detail. The language treats human beings as rentable property. Slaves had no say in assignments. This was property rental, not negotiation. Visit duration depended entirely on wealth. Single visits lasted 1 night from dusk to dawn. Extended stays ran 3 to 7 days for the wealthiest clients. The season operated May through September. Calm season warm weather made crossing comfortable. Offs meant skeleton staff maintained facilities while most slaves were housed in bare. Peak traffic occurred during midsummer months. Up to 50 visitors per island per night was common. Morning departures followed strict schedules. Boats left before sunrise to maintain discretion. Slaves cleaned facilities and prepared for the next night. Those designated as damaged, whether through injury, illness, or pregnancy, were removed from rotation. Financial settlements processed through buy banking houses. The public fiction held. Guests had never left their villas. Slaves became unusable for multiple reasons. Age was the most common. After 18 to 20 years old, they were considered too old for primary clientele. Physical injury resulted from activities or punishment. Pregnancy affected female slaves despite attempts at prevention. Illness spread rapidly in confined populations living in close quarters. Resistance, fighting back or refusing commands, marked a slave for removal. Some were simply used up. Psychological damage or loss of appeal made them unprofitable. A resale market absorbed some of the unusable slaves. Mainland brothel in Pompeii and Puteoli purchased those still capable of work. The price crash was dramatic. A slave worth 5,000 sesterces on the island sold for 800 to 200 at resale. Skills allowed some repurposing. Musicians went to taverns. Dancers found employment in theaters. Physical laborers were sold to agricultural estates. Domestic service absorbed older slaves into regular households. But these outcomes were minority cases. Most faced darker fates. Dead and dying slaves created a disposal problem. They could not be returned to markets without raising questions. Bodies could not be transported to the mainland without witnesses. Burial on the islands would create physical evidence. The solution appears in multiple sources. The sea provided the answer. Maritime disposal became standard procedure. Bodies were weighted with rocks and dropped in deep water between islands. Currents in the Bay of Naples carried remains away from shore. The bay reaches depths over 400 feet in the channels between islands. Discovery was impossible. Operations occurred after midnight. Boats departed carrying weighted bundles. Crew consisted of island staff, not hired help. Secret keeping was ensured through direct employment. Plenty the Elder made an oblique reference in his natural history. He mentioned unnatural fish feeding patterns near the islands. Sharks appeared unusually abundant in specific areas. Fish avoided zones despite natural food sources being present. He wrote these observations between 7 and 79 CE. They were contemporaneous with island operations at their peak. Volume estimates come from financial records. If 300 slaves were in the system and 20 to 30% turned over annually, 60 to 90 replacements were needed each year. Not all turnover came from aging out. Death and disposal formed a significant percentage. Conservative estimates suggest 20 to 40 slaves per year disappeared. Over 50 years of documented operation, and the total reaches 1,000 to 2,000 individuals. A legal vacuum enabled everything. No requirement existed to report slave deaths. Property loss did not equal human death under Roman law. No investigations occurred. No inquests were held. No records were required. Masters faced no legal consequences for ending the lives of their own property. The island's isolation prevented even casual witnesses. Perfect crime from a legal standpoint. The slaves who could have testified were at the bottom of the bay, and the sea kept its secrets. The imperial family's connection to the islands was direct and documented. In 2 BCE, Augustus exiled his daughter Julia to Pataria for behavior he deemed scandalous. The charges involved promiscuity and violation of his moral legislation. The same island later hosted pleasure operations. Imperial property was being used for activities the emperor publicly condemned. Tiberius inherited control of Bay Islands when he became emperor. Caligula was documented visiting pleasure facilities in the Bay region during his reign. Nero owned property on Nisida directly through family inheritance. Tax revenue connected imperial finances to island operations. The facilities generated income through the standard Roman tax system, vectigol. The property tax was paid directly to the imperial treasury. Customs duties applied to slave imports arriving at island docks. Luxury goods, wine, and food carried additional taxes. The emperors benefited financially regardless of their personal involvement. Money from exploitation flowed into state coffers. The islands served political purposes beyond entertainment. Foreign ambassadors were brought there as diplomatic tools. Information gathering occurred naturally. Drunk men talked freely. Enslaved attendants reported conversations to operators. Blackmail potential existed on political rivals who visited. Imperial intelligence networks made use of island activities. Caenus, Tiberius's Taurian prefect, was documented using information gathered on islands against senators. Knowledge became power. Participation became vulnerability. No emperor moved to shut the operations down. Elite Roman culture normalized these practices. Emperors were themselves participants or beneficiaries. Economic interests were too valuable to sacrifice. Political costs of enforcement were too high. Moral outrage did not exist in aristocratic circles. The islands continued operating for decades. A double standard governed Roman morality. Public laws against adultery were strictly enforced in the capital. Senators legislated moral behavior. Violations brought prosecution and exile, but private activities on islands were completely ignored. Geography created legal fiction. If it did not happen in Rome, it was not Rome's problem. Juvenal documented this hypocrisy in his satires. The same senators enforcing morality at home were frequenting the islands. Military resources actively protected the operations. The class's census was based at Misenum, just 5 miles from the islands. Naval patrols prevented unauthorized access to the private facilities. Military vessels guarded commercial vice operations. Officers who cooperated received rewards. Island access served as loyalty insurance. State apparatus was redirected to enable private exploitation. The empire's military built to defend Rome's borders was being used to protect senators at play. The system was not hidden, it was simply ignored. August 24, 79 C. Vesuvius erupted with force that buried entire cities. Pompeii disappeared under ash within hours. Herculaneum was sealed beneath superheated mud. The blast was heard hundreds of miles away. Ashfall reached the Baiae region by afternoon. Tsunamis generated by the eruption hit the coastline. Wealthy villa owners fled immediately. Those who hesitated died in their homes. The economic infrastructure supporting the islands collapsed overnight. The client base disappeared. Death claimed some. Relocation scattered others. Economic ruin destroyed the rest. Supply chains broke completely. No more slave shipments arrived from eastern markets. The dealers were dead or bankrupt. Staff abandoned the islands as employers died or vanished. Buildings sustained damage from earthquakes that accompanied the eruption. Ash settled over everything. Within months, all operations ceased. The fate of slaves remaining on the islands went unrecorded. They were stranded initially. No transport existed. No owners remained to order their movement. Some likely died of starvation and neglect. The chaos may have allowed others to escape to the mainland. Abandoned slaves had no legal status. They could not claim freedom. They could not seek protection. No records document organized evacuation. No evidence suggests anyone cared what happened to them. They simply vanished from history. At this point, the Roman government seized abandoned private properties. Standard procedure dictated that ownerless estates reverted to imperial control. Subsequent emperors showed no interest in reviving island operations. The cultural moment had passed. Occasional use continued for traditional purposes. Political exiles were still sent to Panditaria, but pleasure operations never resumed at previous scale. By 100 CE, the building stood in ruins. Christianity's rise changed Rome's moral landscape. 2nd and 3rd century writers increasingly condemned pagan excess. The islands became symbols in Christian rhetoric. They represented corrupt decadence that the new faith rejected. Memory transformed from participation to condemnation. Later, Romans actively denied their ancestors' involvement. The shift was convenient. It allowed Rome to distance itself from uncomfortable history. Geological forces completed the erasure. Bradyseismic activity causes land in the Bay Area to rise and fall. Parthenope Island now rests completely underwater. Nida and Proca were depopulated for centuries. Medieval fishermen used them without knowledge of the past. Physical evidence was destroyed by time, geological changes, and deliberate forgetting. The evidence survived through multiple channels. Financial records were preserved in Pompeii's ash. The eruption that destroyed the city also froze its archives. Banking documents, contracts, and ledgers remained intact for 2 millennia. Literary references appeared in works by Seneca, Martial, Juvenal, and Enel, and Tacitus. Each writer approached the subject differently. All confirmed basic operations existed. Christian PMCS against pagan practices preserved details. Early Christian writers condemned Roman vice to demonstrate moral superiority. Their hostility actually helped preserve specific information. They described what they opposed in enough detail to document reality. Graffiti found in bay mentions islands by name. Casual references in wall writings show common knowledge among residents. Later Roman legal reforms referenced island abuses. Lawmakers acknowledged problems while declining to name names. The references were oblique but present in legal codes. Source reliability requires assessment. Multiple independent sources confirm basic operations. Financial documents provide unemotional data. Numbers do not carry bias. Literary sources show clear biases but maintain consistency. Christian sources were hostile but preserve specifics. The convergence from different perspectives strengthens credibility. What the sources agree on forms the reliable core. Islands operated as private pleasure venues for decades. Wealthy Romans visited regularly through organized systems. Enslaved people were forced to provide entertainment and service. Activities included explicit exploitation under legal protection. Operations continued with imperial knowledge and financial benefit. The Vesuvius eruption ended the system permanently. Uncertainty remains on specific points. Exact victim numbers are estimates. The range runs from 1,000 to 3,000 over 50 years. Specific individual names are mostly lost. Precise details of activities are described through euphemism or condemnation. Direct imperial family participation versus passive tolerance remains unclear. Whether any slaves survived to old age is unknown. Significant gaps exist in the record. No first-person slave account survived. Enslaved people were largely illiterate. Those who could write were silenced or killed. No trial records exist because no prosecutions occurred. Physical remains are limited. Geology and time destroyed building sites. Later generations deliberately suppressed history. Christian-era Romans wanted to forget what pagan ancestors did. Not one enslaved person's name survives in the records. They existed only as inventory line items. Boy, Greek origin 14 years, 500 sisteraces. Girl, Syrian years, 4,000 sistresses. The ledgers tracked property, not people. Thousands passed through the system over 5 decades. Each had a life before the markets. Family who raised them. Languages they spoke first. Villages where they played as children. Homes they were torn from. Roman record-keeping erased all of it. Only commercial value mattered to those who documented transactions. We know what they experienced through the system itself. Capture came through war, piracy, or sale by desperate parents. Markets displayed them like livestock. Transport ships carried them across the Mediterranean.